So we're going to start with Cindi, and if all of the panelists could just briefly introduce themselves and very briefly in terms of their role in the event, and then I can show your footage, or you can introduce yourself while your clips are playing too. So, should I go ahead and get started, Cindi, or?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and play this, and hopefully you guys can see her, and she'll talk over it.
Actually, Leon, pause real quick, please. Can you pause real quick? Great, thanks. I just wanted to give a really super quick preamble. Hi, I'm Cindi Preller. I work at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. 10 years ago, I was at the National Tsunami Warning Center in Alaska. And part of my little piece here, I'm going to be as quick as I can, but I want to, wow, thank you all for joining us and remembering this is an incredibly important and sad day, so thank you for that. The United States has 2 tsunami warning centers that are sister centers to each other, and we work events together. And the Alaska North Campus Center is responsible for the continent, basically, including Canada, but not Mexico. And the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, which is the first tsunami warning center for the United States, is responsible for the Pacific region, the Caribbean, as well as our international partners. So together, we do what we can for the rest of the world. However, we're not the only ones in the world, and so this video is highlighting the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, and their warning system. And their warning system is quite advanced. They're actually able to warn their citizens in ways that we hope that we can also do as well someday. And so I'm going to start with that. That's the point of this video. Thanks, Leon. So the
緊急地震速報です。強い揺れに警戒してください。
And they're able to issue an earthquake warning moments.
強い揺れに警戒してください。
緊急地震速報です。次の地域では強い揺れに警戒してください。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県です。揺れが来るまではわずかな時間しかありません。怪我をしないように自分の身の安全を守ってください。倒れやすい家具などからは離れてください。また上から落ちてくるものに気をつけてください。
You can start to see the light flickering, and so the Japanese Congress is now starting to feel the earthquake. So they got the warning out before anybody was feeling the earthquake. First, I'd like to see them all duck, cover, and hold.
倒れやすい家具などからは離れてください。 今この国会でも揺れを感じています。先ほど国会の中の揺れがまだ続いています。
Now they're really starting to feel it.
揺れが始まってから10秒以上経過しました。次第に。
The thing I love about this video is it's live, it's real time.
国会中継の途中ですが、地震津波関連の情報をお伝えします。今東京のスタジオも揺れています。緊急地震速報が出ました。宮城県、岩手県、福島県、秋田県、山形県に緊急地震速報です。また今東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れを感じています。東京渋谷のスタジオも揺れています。強い揺れを観測した地域の皆さんにお伝えします。落ち着いて行動してください。揺れが収まってから火の始末をしてください。まず上から落ちてくるものや倒れてくるものから身を守ってください。現在東京渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。東京渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。建物の倒壊や山崩れ、崖崩れの恐れがあります。上から落ちてくるもの、倒れてくるものから身を守ってください。今東京渋谷のスタジオが非常に大きく揺れています。東京の渋谷のスタジオが大きく揺れています。上から落ちてくるもの、倒れてくるものからまず身を守ってください。揺れが収まるまでしばらく安全な場所にいてください。揺れが収まってから火の始末をしてください。 NHK では新しい情報が入り次第お伝えします。テレビやラジオのスイッチを切らないでください。午後2時46分ごろ、東北地方で強い地震がありました。震度7が宮城県北部です。震度7が宮城県北部。 また震度5弱が山形県、震度6強が宮城県中部、福島県中通り、福島県浜通り、茨城県北部、震度6弱が岩手県沿岸南部、岩手県内陸北部、岩手県内陸南部、宮城県南部などとなっています。
Another option in Japan, when there's a strong earthquake, all the traffic stops. Now here's the tsunami warning. It's broadcast in multiple languages, and what's interesting is your ear will hear your language.
ているのは岩手県、宮城県、福島県です。大津波警報が出ました。海岸や川の河口付近には絶対に近づかないでください。大津波警報についての緊急ニュースを津波警報が出ている沿岸です。中国語、北海道太平洋沿岸です。ポルトガル語でお伝えします。今津波にか津波警報が出ているのは北海道太平洋沿岸中部、青森県太平洋沿岸、茨城県、千葉県九十九里外房、伊豆諸島です。いずれも2メートルから1メートルの波が到達すると予想されています。もう一度大津波警報の出ている沿岸をお伝えします。岩手県3メートル、宮城県6メートル、福島県3メートルです。
There you go. So just to wrap, very efficient warning system, and yes, over 20,000 people died. But if you think about in 2004 in Indonesia, almost 300,000 people died. So this really is an example of an excellent warning system. And we have a lot to learn, but we also have a lot to remember. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. I appreciate it. I'm going to, oops, sorry about that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nathan.
So hi, like Cindy, I work at the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, and I was on duty for this event 10 years ago today. The first video we're going to show is an animation I've made with one of my colleagues here, Dailin Wong, that shows one of our newer tools. It's a forecast model we developed in-house, and this is an animation I made with it that shows the propagation of this tsunami across the Pacific Ocean. And one of the things I like about these animations is that it shows so many aspects of the tsunami at the same time. You can see how fast they move. You see the important characteristic that there are multiple waves, not a single wave that sweeps across the ocean. And it also shows the impacts to the coastline. In this animation, as the waves progress out, it uses the same color scheme for the waves and for the coastal impact. And in many cases, you'll see that the colors on the coasts are far more severe than the nearest waves in the open ocean. And this is a result of the fact that these waves, when they enter shallow water, their amplitude increases as they come ashore, and then that's what makes them dangerous. Out on the open ocean, they're not a threat to boats, for example, out in deep water. But it's the coastlines that are the hazard here. And that's the criterion we use now for our international products, is we use this very forecast model. Might as well advance it, Leon. If you want to see this in its entirety, we have a YouTube channel that has this animation and many others for other tsunamis. So this is video that was shot, as it says there, about 2.5 hours after the first arrival. Can we kill the sound as well? Yeah, thank you. So this is, as the sun's rising in Kailua Kona, you can see the waves inundating the coastline right there at Ali'i Drive in Kailua Kona, but the important thing, this is 2.5 hours in. It's still a hazard 2.5 hours after the first waves came in. They first arrived, sometime around 3:30 in the morning, but only now it can be seen. And you can see this is, why Hawaii was in a tsunami warning status, an evacuation status. So the person shooting this video did us a favor by getting the video, but he did himself no favors by risking his life to get it. And just like in Tohoku, you see it atop a seawall. This is a much, much smaller seawall. The tsunami is not nearly as large, but it is definitely a hazard to this area. And I think we can go to the next one. And so the next video was shot approximately the same time as the one you just saw. And I believe this is the second wave arrival in Santa Cruz. Can we maximize it? Thanks. So this is going up the river in Santa Cruz, and the waves aren't as large as you just saw, but it's still quite hazardous. You can see it's pushing the boats around. If anybody was on docks there, they would be in harm's way. But also this video was shot by people who were told to evacuate. You could see people on the shorelines standing around watching this phenomenon. But I think Cindi can correct me, but I think this met the warning criteria for North America as well. But so this is a Pacific-wide event. It impacted Hawaii, it impacted North America. It actually killed one person in California. There was only one person I'm aware of that was also killed by a tsunami outside of Japan, and that was in Papua, Indonesia. So the tsunami warning works. If you can get the word out, most people will avoid the hazard and will survive these events. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate it. So we'll, oops, sorry about that. We'll turn it over to Jesse.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jesse Bohlander, and I work for the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center with the Protected Species Division. And I'm connected to this event because I was part of the emergency contact team for our field staff that were in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands at the time. So the map at the top shows the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. The circles in red are places in the monument that had staff during this event. So for NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and DLNR had staff at Curie, Midway, Laysan, and French Frigate Shoals. And then the two starred locations were where I have photos here. So these are from the overflight that happened about a week after the event. So as far as timeline, we got the notification at about 8 p.m. Hawaii time, and we have protocols for our field staff, basically to stay close to their satellite phones at all times, particularly for tsunamis, because other big events, we have a little bit of warning, days. With tsunamis, we have hours. So we got a hold of our staff pretty quickly, and basically we're on the phone with them all night, about every hour or more as needed. And because the waves hit the Northwest Hawaiian Islands first, our staff that were on the ground and our partner staff that were on the ground gave us a sense of really the timing of the tsunami and what the following islands might see. And then that was all before it came to the main Hawaiian Islands closer to the next day. So we were very fortunate that we didn't have our full camps out, which are at the lower laying islands. Laysan has a maximum height above sea level of about 40 feet, which isn't huge, but it was just enough for this event. So the photo on the left is Laysan Island, and the little buildings you can see are where the Fish and Wildlife camp was, and that's kind of the highest point of the island, and that's where all the staff were. I believe there was 2 or 4 Fish and Wildlife personnel and then 3 NOAA personnel, and so they were up there. And you can kind of see where the debris line is. It washed through our camp, which is about halfway between the Fish and Wildlife camp and the shoreline, up to about 50 feet from the Fish and Wildlife camp. And this all happened in the middle of the night. So we didn't get video because it was dark and they were sheltering, but they couldn't see when it was coming. They could hear the brush breaking. I was on the phone with the field camp leader at Laysan about 2 a.m. and she said, yeah, we're okay, but wait, I think I hear something. I hear brush breaking. Hang on, let me call you back. And she hung up, and I just thought, man, I hope she calls me back. And she did. Luckily, everybody ended up being safe. Our camp at Curie has a little bit more height above sea level at their main camp. And so the waves at Curie washed about 500 meters inland, and the house that their base camp is about 700 meters inland. So everybody was safe there. But it was just a long night. And after this event, we have changed a lot of our protocols in terms of contact and preparing for emergencies, the gear that they have on the island. Afterwards, everybody was fine, but a lot of their supplies were washed away. They were found on the other side of the island. Some of the Laysan supplies were actually found on Midway months later. And so we fortunately had a NOAA ship, Hi'ialakai, was transiting, I believe, to somewhere else in the Pacific, but they diverted to go pick up the staff at Laysan and Curie, took them to Midway, and then they were able to fly home about a week after the event. So this is one of the events that we worry the most about when we have field staff in the Northwestern Islands. And after this, we've had more hurricane events since then. And so we started, I'm a member now of the Monument Emergency Management Team. So we stand up kind of meetings and preparation before every field season. We've dealt with hurricanes, tsunamis, but this is the worst that's happened sort of since then. So that's my story for the tsunami, and I'll pass it back to Leon.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate that perspective. So we'll go ahead and go on to, again, feel free to type in questions that you have. You can just type it directly into chat, and we'll get a chance to answer them after we kind of have our opening presentations here. So I'll turn it over to David.
All right, thank you, Leon. Can you hear me okay?
Can do.
Okay, great. So just saying that having been to most of the sites that were in the videos that we just watched, and having spent a lot of time in Japan, it was actually very difficult watching those videos. But there's also a lot to be learned from the videos through scientific analyses from a project I'll be describing now, as well as other aspects that future planners and responders were learning from. So my name is David Phillips. I'm currently the Deputy Scientist in charge of the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. Back in 2011, I worked at UNAVCO, which is the National Science Foundation Center for Geodesy. And my involvement in the Tohoku tsunami response started actually in May. So a little bit after the events of March 11th. And it started with a phone call out of the blue from well-known tsunami researcher Herman Fritz. It was a Friday night. I'd actually been scanning dinosaur tracks all day in Golden, Colorado. Got a call and it went something like this. He said, "I'm Herman Fritz. Is this David Phillips from UNAVCO?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the guy with the laser?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Can you meet me in Japan next week?" I'm like, "Yes." And here's a photo of me in Japan the very next week. And what we were doing is he was analyzing the survivor eyewitness videos that we saw in the special earlier. And from the videos, actually measuring the full dynamics of the water, not just the highest height, but between the highest and the lowest, and the dynamics and the current velocities in between. But you've seen what the videos are like. You know, it's like you got the shaky cam, you've got it moving around. You see objects, but how far away are they? How are they moving? And LIDAR is a type of data that can help calibrate those videos. So the goal of our work was to visit many of the key sites that you saw in those videos. We would go to the exact place where the video was taken and set up the laser scanner where it is on this tripod. And we're standing at this site at Yori Isohama, which is one of the ones that you saw in the video. And you can see in the bay in the background. And this is a Okuyasu professor in Japan that we were working with as well, and one of his students. Next slide, please. And this is now down by the water, looking back up towards the video site where we were just standing. And even though it's 2 months later, you'll see that there was still extremely widespread devastation, and most of the areas we went were still evacuated and closed. Next slide, please. So let's go ahead and play this video, just kind of highlighting how this worked. So these scenes look familiar to you from the video that we just watched. This is the bridge up at Miyako. And so right where the video survivor here was standing, we went and set up the laser scanner. And this is now a LIDAR image of the exact same scene. But as a LIDAR point cloud, we now have millions of points in 3D space that represent the scenes in the video. Oh, wow. And now we know exactly how far away those objects are, how high they were. We can measure changes in the water height and the velocity through time. You probably recognize this building. This is the one at Kesanuma. And the data that we got from this demonstrated a maximum run-up height of about 10 meters at these buildings and outflow of about 11 meters per second as the water was going back out. It's about 25 miles per hour in terms of the water flow, and which most boats and ships just cannot navigate against. So it was violent, it was merciless, and you can see some of the videos that the survivors on the tops of those buildings, which were designated evacuation areas. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So that's back at Yuri Sohama. Again, just a picture of what it's like working in these conditions. It was my first time working in a disaster zone. The scale is incomprehensible. To be in a place, to see the sights, to smell the smells, to know what happened there is pretty overwhelming. But you're able to focus on the work as best you can, collect the data. And this is just giving a sense. A lot of these buildings were damaged on the bottom, so we would have to climb ladders and use ropes to get the equipment up in some of the scanning places. And we were always coordinating with the local officials, Japan Coast Guard, the mayors, the Japan Defense Force, and so on. Next slide. Just another example to what's lurking there. This is a case where the smells were incredibly bad here. Even after the tsunami, you have a lot of decaying biologic matter still, fish and vegetation and whatnot. And on the roof that I'm on now, there were a lot of debris. There were still boats and ships on top of buildings. And in this case, there was a refrigerator that was washed up on the building and everything inside had spoiled. And so you can imagine it smelled pretty bad. Next slide. Let's just shuffle through here. We went to Miyako, which you saw in the video. Next slide. Here's Kamaishi, where you saw the big ship, and if the ship looks weird, it's because it really is on shore still. It's no longer in the water. On the left, and then over on the right, that shows us up on the top of the building. Yep, and the next slide actually goes into that, scanning the ship and the whole coastline there at Kamaishi from the LIDAR data. Next slide. This is at Kesanuma again. You can see me in the foreground in the lower right. That was all underwater. Everything on the ground has been swept away, and you can see the evacuation symbol. This was a designated evacuation site. The videos were taken up there. That's where the videos were. Here at Kesanuma, that worked out well. In other places, like in Minami Sanriku, even people who had evacuated to the designated centers, the water just went right over the buildings. Next slide. So just wrapping things up here, a lot of important scientific results came out of this study. There was a special edition of GRL, and so we have a paper in that edition describing some of the measurements at Kesanuma. But I also I think about this work in the context of everything else, and not just modern science and observations, but really what the Japanese people and others who live in coastal hazard zones have done through time, as long as people have lived in these hazardous areas. My good friend in Japan, Yasushi Harada, sent me these pictures of these stone markers that exist throughout Tohoku, where previous generations marked and described tsunami and designated places where the water went and how high up it went, and the places that were destroyed and people were lost. And I think about the work that we do today as an extension of that, using modern tools. What did we see? What did we learn? How can we remember and honor those who did perish and the survivors who went? And how can we mitigate this in the future? So this work, just like so much else that PTWC and others do, is informing current and future generations alike. And that'll be it for me for now.
Thanks so much, David. Appreciate seeing some of those on the ground pictures there. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. I'll let Mark introduce himself.
Hello, Mike Kako. Mark Manuel. I'm the Pacific Islands Regional Coordinator for the NOAA Marine Debris Program. And at that time, I was actually getting ready, ironically, for our 5th International Marine Debris Conference, which was hosted in Honolulu. So that's what I was prepping for at the time. From a marine debris program or marine debris perspective, the government of Japan estimated that 5 million tons of debris was carried into the ocean from following that massive tsunami, 70% of which they felt sank near shore waters, so leaving about 1.5 million tons of floating debris adrift in the Pacific. Following the tsunami, we worked really closely with our impacted states and local partners to really monitor and respond to tsunami debris found along our U.S. shorelines. We led efforts with federal, state, and local partners to collect data, assess the debris, and reduce possible impacts of natural resources and coastal communities. This was really accomplished through a generous goodwill gift of $5 million from the Japan government. And all in all, with those funds, an estimated 635 metric tons of debris was removed along the coasts of Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, and California. From a modeling perspective, our Office of Response and Restoration utilized an oceanographic model called GNOME, G-N-O-M-E, and estimated debris removal or movement. Really, the model took into account the fact that winds can move different types and shapes of debris at different speeds. And so we provided regular updates with the GNOME model and provided snapshots of where the debris was at the time, and really didn't make future predictions of where it would end up. So it was more of a hindcast rather than a forecast. We stopped or discontinued those regular updates to the GNOME model in 2015. In order to observe and understand the different types of and the amount of tsunami debris reaching our shorelines, many of our NOAA partners and volunteers throughout the Pacific Rim states conducted monthly shoreline monitoring surveys, utilizing a marine debris monitoring assessment project protocol that began in 2012. Notably, the greatest amount of debris was really found here in Hawaii, with an average of more than 40 debris items being deposited over a 100-meter stretch of beach per day. And it really led to the future expansion of the Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project, which is a citizen science-based initiative that engages our partners and volunteers across the world to survey and record the different types of record the amount and types of marine debris along our shorelines. And then starting in December of 2011, our program, or our Office of Response and Restoration, received hundreds of reports of tsunami debris from vessels at sea as well as beachgoers throughout the Pacific states through our online reporting system. And these items ranged in size from small plastic water bottles to derelict vessels. And several of these items were actually definitively traced back to the tsunami event itself. And some were actually returned with the help of the government Japan and local consulates. And so many of these items had various registration and serial numbers or some unique marker that really helped us identify the owner and confirm that it entered the ocean following the result of the tsunami. And so through our reporting system, we have a cumulative list of sightings of 1,703, which is definitely an underestimate. Nearly a quarter of those sightings were coming from Hawaii. And of the 73 items, large items that we confirmed, nearly 50% or 36 items were found or sighted here in Hawaii. And so I'll kind of leave it there and then hand it back to Leon for some Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I want to just give, before we jump into Q&A, I see a couple of questions there in the chat. If we can all just give our presenters a big round of applause. We pulled this together pretty quickly in the end, and I want to thank everyone. I also want a big shout out to Beth Lumstead, the acting regional coordinator, who kind of helped coordinate and contact. So thank you all for kind of pulling this together, and we'll go ahead and answer some questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. Let me look in the chat, or first let me look at our questions thing. Let's see if anyone actually used that. Not seeing anything there. We'll go to the chat, and one of the questions I see, I'll point this to Nathan or Cindi. How rare an event was the tsunami? And maybe I'll add on to that of whether it's changed any of our evacuation zones here locally. So one of you two can take that.
So sure, I mean, in terms of rarity, this was the first tsunami of this size or earthquake of this size in more than 50 years in the Pacific. In Japan, it was the first in about 1,000 years, I think, that was about this magnitude. Japan has tsunamis very commonly, but one of this scale and magnitude is pretty rare overall. But on the other hand, we had one in 2004 in Indonesia that was comparable in magnitude and destructive power. But if you look over the historic record, which for earthquakes, instrumentally recorded earthquakes, is only about 120 years. There's maybe a dozen of these things that are quite this size, and they don't occur evenly in time. But that's just the nature of random events. We went for a few decades in the 50s and 60s where we had several of these, and then nothing for 40 years, and then the last 2 decades we've had several more. So for tsunamis of this scale, they're pretty rare. But for some tsunamis overall, we probably get a couple per year somewhere in the world. We put out an alert a couple times a month for earthquakes we're concerned about. We had one last week, which is really unusual, which had 3 events in one day. All 3 of them made tsunamis. The third one was a damaging and dangerous tsunami. So they're rare events, but they're very high impact events, which make them challenging to mitigate. as to your question about evacuation maps, the Japan tsunami did lead to reevaluation of Hawaii's evacuation plans, because a similar earthquake, if it was in the Aleutians and pointing at just the right place, would be put waves beyond what the old evacuation maps planned for. So it prompted a revision there.
Thanks, Nathan. Let's see, just going on to questions here. Maybe I'll field this one to Mark. And again, if anyone sees one that I missed, I might be jumping around a little bit. Ray's asking whether we're still seeing any marine debris wash up from the event.
Good question. I continuously get reports, and so how that works is I get reports through our NOAA reporting link, as well as the state DLNR marine debris report form. I take that information, I pass it on to the Consulate of Japan, my connection there, and then they go back and report to Tokyo to see if we can confirm it. I think the most recent report was just last year. I think it was early last year, January, February timeframe, and there was a piece of a boat with a registration number, which is likely tied to the event itself. So we continue to see it. Right now, it's really challenging to differentiate some of that tsunami-related debris from just miscellaneous debris that enters our Pacific Rim. But those small fishing vessels are really an indicator or a key connection to the tsunami event itself. So we continue to see pieces of them, not necessarily whole vessels at this point.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe this one is directed toward Jesse about safety measures. This is a question from Michael, if you can see in the chat. What safety measures should we consider for conducting shallow water snorkel field work in remote locations?
That is a good question, and not quite in my realm of specialty. We don't do a lot of snorkel work with our team in the monument, but I would say it would be probably a combination of your dive and snorkel safety measures of having a lookout, having a partner, and then just always having the ability to have somebody contact you wherever you are. Mark actually might be able to speak to this a little bit more, because at this time he was part of the PIF's marine debris team who does more remote dive work. So Mark, do you have any other input?
No, I think you hit it on the head. NOAA Dive Center would have probably more stringent protocols, and there's mission plans that are completed prior to any in-water work or any field effort. So I would say work through, since it's Michael, yeah, so it's PIF, so you work with the Science Operations Division, and they would probably point you in the right direction on all the best management practices and safety procedures you need to follow.
Yeah, we got a question from Francine about, I think we'll direct this to David. So what was it like to stand in that exact place where those survivor videos were taken, or where so many people lost their lives?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's hard to describe, to be honest. It's overwhelming emotionally. Most of the time, just because of the nature of the field work, it's so fast paced. With all field work, there's so much to be done in such a short period of time, and you get someplace and it's overwhelming, and then you focus on the task at hand, and you do your best to do that. But then, you would come to a time or a place, or maybe something would happen, and then it would just all of a sudden hit me. It's like, wow, I'm standing exactly where that video was taken. And it's a bit overwhelming to be there at that time. And so it would come in waves like that, being able to focus on the work, and then being able to get the sense of, everybody watched the video that we just saw, and it's overwhelming. And nowadays with movies and everything with CGI, it's hard sometimes to get a sense of reality versus the crazy things we see in movies. But to be there and realize this was real. And you see the destruction, you think about the people who lost their lives, and you think about the people who are still impacted by it. So for me, it was that mixture at the time between focusing on the work and really taking into account and realizing what happened there, and also feeling very respectful of the people and what they went through and going forward.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. I'm just going to turn over to Cindi, and maybe she can talk a little bit about her perspective when she was at the National Tsunami Warning Center. And maybe you can give people some context of where that is and your experience on that day, just so people have maybe some background there.
Oh, sure, happy to. That was in the evening that night, and I was actually on Facebook chatting with my Alaska tsunami partner, Irv Petty, and we were just discussing the program like we do at weird hours, and the NHK video came through, and I checked the Japanese gauges, the tide gauges, and the one closest to the epicenter, I could see the water rise very severely, and then the gauge was gone. So the data just quit, right? So it's like, okay. So it's like, we got to go in. So Irv and I went in. It's tricky in both warning centers. The Alaska Center is about an hour north of Anchorage in Palmer, so it's definitely not in a tsunami zone. But both centers are working tightly together. We're doing the same thing, even though we have different customers that we're addressing. But it always starts out with just two people, especially if it's in the middle of the night and there's an event. It's just two people, and they're doing their very best to figure out the magnitude and figure out the risk and get a warning out in hopefully less than 5 minutes if possible, especially for a local event. That's important. For this event, for both of our warning centers, as well as all of our customers that are domestic anyway, our international customers were closer, but our domestic customers, we had several hours before the water would be arriving, so we had a little time to work with. But as soon as you hear it, you just come in. And so, you know, people came trickling in, but it was over 30 hours later before we were done. And, you know, you just get into a groove. You start modeling, and you work with NEIC and the National Earthquake Information Center with USGS. And the one thing I love about our program is that we really are a collaborative of partners from a bunch of different agencies, universities, states, emergency managers, military. So, you know, we're all working together. The tough thing is the media wants to know what's going to happen. And, you know, we were watching the NHK videos at the same time as everybody else. So that was a little tough. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thanks, Cindi. So I know we are at time, so I know people, just a time check, it is 2:30. If our panelists are still willing to stay and answer a few questions, you're welcome to. I also realize people have time commitments. So we're happy to stick around. There is a question from Aaron about how would we receive a tsunami warning center? How would we receive a tsunami warning, and where do we go? I don't know if that pertains specifically to a locally driven one or maybe in general. So maybe Nathan or Cindi, you can say, well, how do we get warnings if one's happening?
Sure, I'll start and I'll let Cindi finish on this. It's more her area. But when we issue a tsunami warning, it's directed toward emergency managers first. And we have a number of electronics communication circuits, as well as a website where they all get published, and then they get distributed from there. So for the state of Hawaii, it's the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. And we send them an electronic message. We also have a hotline, of dedicated phone line. We pick up and call them and have conference calls with them. And they're the ones that decide to blow the sirens when there's a warning that's going to impact, you know, and a hazard to Hawaii. So we work very closely with them to coordinate on those kinds of events. We also have social media presence, but that's an experimental product officially, and it's really done the sort of catch as catch can. Right now, it's not automated as yet. But as Cindi alluded to, we talk to the media. The phones we turn into basically a phone call center during one of these events, and it's all hands on deck, and everybody's talking to somebody, whether it's the media or whether it's an emergency manager or even members of the general public. You have anything to add, Cindi?
Yeah, I was going to say, or the White House, you know, I mean, you could be talking to a little girl in Kansas who has family out in Shimia, and then have the White House in your very next call, and then BBC, and then, you know, whoever. It's just mayhem. It goes out via email, it goes out via text, it goes out via fax. I mean, we have a lot of places that get it via fax, which is amazing. Of course, hopefully our media is all trained up on tsunami science and facts, and so they are disseminating information. Tsunami.gov is our website, and so our current message status, as well as the messages themselves, should be there. One of our, it's experimental, and so it's certainly not official, but one of our best ways of disseminating is actually through Twitter. A lot of people will get an automated Twitter messages, not all of them, and unfortunately we're getting there. And let's see what else. You said social media. I know, oh, WIA, hello. The warning emergency alert system. If you just happen to be in a 4K plus network, or I'm sorry, not 4K, but 4G. Certainly not 2G. I'm not sure about 3G, but you'll get an automatic alert on your phone from emergency management via the WEA alert system. And that's the same thing that goes along the crawler of your television when we have an emergency that interrupts with the tones. So that should go, you should hear sirens, but honestly, you may be somewhere where you don't get the official warning at all, so it's a really good idea to learn tsunami, nature's warning signs. Heavy shaking knocks you on your feet. Please go to high ground, get away from the water. You hear something weird. How about you don't hear the ocean at all? Please go to high ground. It's really good to educate yourself if you are in a tsunami zone. Where are you going to go? Do that ahead of time. If you're traveling, check if that area, like I'm going to go to Thailand for a holiday. And, you know, all of a sudden Thailand, of course, didn't feel the earthquake, but they definitely experienced the warning signs. So, yeah, I guess I could go on and on. So I will stop. Anyway, thank you for that question.
I don't know if, does anyone see, there's quite a bit of chat. Any other questions in there for folks? I do see a question about the airport from Walter, how vulnerable Hawaii's airports are to tsunami. What would it take for them to be like a Sendai airport? I guess that's reinforcing the airport. I'm not entirely sure of the question, but maybe you can address that.
I mean, maybe this is a good time to bring up tsunami.coast.noaa.gov and their evacuation maps. And I believe the airport is shown on there.
Yeah, I'll do that.
But so, yeah, our airport's at sea level, and but it's also on the South Shore. And historically, the South Shore of Oahu hasn't had huge tsunami impacts, but it's not impossible. The so-called Ring of Fire is really more of a horseshoe shape. There's not much due south of us that generates tsunamis, but they tend to come from the west and the east and the north. So is it possible to flood? Yeah, absolutely. You see the reef runway there is red on that map. The yellow area indicates what we call an extreme event, which we have not had in historic times in Hawaii. But when I alluded to earlier, I think I mentioned this, if we had a earthquake like we just had in Japan, like we were talking about, if that was in the Aleutians and pointed at us, it could make, it might require an evacuation from the yellow areas as well. In that case, the entire airport is affected. The other airports, of course, in the state are also at sea level. Not all of them, but Hilo, of course, is. Lihue, Kahului, most of them are. I think the only exception might be Molokai and Lanai. But it's interesting to bring up airports because it's not just the airport here. Northwest Hawaiian Islands, the island of Midway was essentially submerged by this tsunami. And that's a critical alternate landing site for trans-Pacific aircraft. If you have two engines on a jetliner, you can't travel more than a certain distance from a emergency landing site. And when Midway was effectively taken out for several months, they had to change all their routes, so they flew over the Aleutian Islands for a while.
Thanks, Nathan. So I know we're running a bit over here. We still have about 60 people here. Maybe we can just, if anyone has any kind of closing comments and that they'd like to kind of share with the group. Otherwise, I know people have asked to save the chat. We are gathering up a Google Doc that has a list of all of the different resources that each of our panelists can contribute. So we can provide that for everyone who attended today's meeting. So you can kind of follow up with that. I don't see any other questions. Maybe a last one from Beth. on where did the tsunami hit after Japan and before Hawaii, and were you able to assist with those nations? Maybe we can end there, and we'll have that be our final question.
From what I'm aware of, before Hawaii, I know Guam, which is not a foreign country, was impacted. There was a submarine that was torn from its moorings and did some significant damage within its harbor. Papua, which is Indonesia, had some significant impacts, damage there, and the one death that I mentioned. I'm not sure of the timing. Before Hawaii, I mentioned Midway, a Wake Island would be on the way, but also the Kuril Islands, Kamchatka, up in Russia would be another country that would be affected potentially before Hawaii. Now, but it did go all the way across and impact Chile 22 hours later. I believe there was 2 meters of run-up, 2-meter high waves in Chile, but they had plenty of time for people to get out of the way. The Galapagos, if I recall correctly, were also significantly impacted by this tsunami.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. If there aren't any other final questions, Laura is pointing out that April is Hawaii Tsunami Awareness Month, and they're planning some different activities and social media campaigns for the next tsunami. So be on the lookout for some of that coming up in the next month. If there aren't any other questions, I will go ahead. Oh, there is maybe one last one dealing with a very current event. So maybe that's a good one to cover, and then we can wrap it up. Michael's asking about the earthquakes last week and the resulting tsunami warning. Why wasn't as a why this was not another devastating event? So maybe we can end on that, given some current events.
That's a good question for Cindi, because she worked that event.
The very first, there were 3 earthquakes last week north of New Zealand. The first one was a 7.4. So that is a very large earthquake. I mean, there's just no doubt. I mean, even a 5 is a large earthquake, but in the tsunami world, a 7.4 actually isn't that large. And so Tohoku was, what's our final, 9.1 on it? Or 9?
9.05.
So there we go. So the amount of energy, the difference of energy between something in the 7s and something in the 9s determines really whether or not it'll propagate all the way across the ocean if it has enough energy to do so. So these ones in the 7s, even the third one that was an 8, didn't have the energy to propagate across the ocean like a magnitude 9 from Japan or Chile or Alaska or Indonesia would. So really the long-winded answer on that is that it didn't have as much energy to be as devastating, which is great. You know, we're really happy when our tsunamis don't hurt people, right? And they give us something to study. It certainly was measured in New Zealand, and luckily no one was hurt there. And a super unique event. It gives us a lot to study. So hopefully I actually answered that question.
I would only add to that is that the orientation of the fault was such that it shoots the majority of the energy to the southeast. Tsunamis tend to radiate at right angles to the faults that generate them, and the Tonga Trench runs from the northeast to the southwest. So most of the tsunami energy was directed to the southeast and towards South America ultimately, not directly at Hawaii. In 2009, there was a earthquake at the northern end of that trench where it curves around and was pointed more towards Hawaii. And it was definitely observed here, though it wasn't dangerous in Hawaii.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have in terms of the questions. Thank you we still have 50 people sort of hanging around, so I appreciate everyone hanging around. And in terms of resources, I'll just do a quick plug. The Pacific, Nathan's made some pretty amazing tsunami animations that are up there that you can compare different tsunamis. If you do want to have it mobile, you can just download them from the App Store. If you do Google SOS Explorer, all of those tsunami animations are available there too. So thank you everyone for joining us. And in terms of the next engagement event, Pacific Islands engagement event, we're looking at having something in April dealing with Earth Day and Earth Month. So be on the lookout for that. All right, let's give another round of applause for our virtual round of applause for our presenters and panelists. And thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate it, guys.